those places that have more of those elements should do better. They should smell like roses. Right? Now, if the Marxists are right, Marxists and other types of central planning types, they say, no, you can't have personal choice. We need a plan. Right? You can't have free trade. We need to protect workers. Right? We can't have private property. We need to have communal property. If Marx is right, then countries that do what we see here, they should smell like rotten eggs. They should not look good. So that's what we want to do. We want to measure economic freedom, because once we measure economic freedom, we can start to empirically ask those sorts of questions. Do countries that look more like Smith's view of the world do better or worse on various dimensions than countries that look like the Marxist or the other side's argument? Okay. I won't bore you too much with the methodology, but at the end of the day, this is going to be a rating exercise. What Jim Gortney and I do, Jim's a professor at Florida State University, and I was initially I was his research assistant, now of course his co-author on this project. What we do is we collect data, and we currently have 141 nations in countries in the index. They're grouped into five areas, which I'll show you in a moment, but everything is done on 0 to 10 ratings, and 10 is going to be Smith, and 0 is Marx. And if you're a Marxist and you want to invert that scale, you are more than welcome to do that. But I'm doing this, and I'm kind of a Smithian at heart, so I'm going to make 10 higher numbers my side, okay? So 10 means you're closer to the free market ideal. Now, if there's any anarcho-capitalist, Murray Rothbard people out there, 10 doesn't mean perfect. It simply means better than the 9s, right? It's all relative. In terms of the methodology of the index, everything we do is data gathered from published third-party sources. So this is kind of important to me in terms of the way we do the index. I don't sit in my office in central Alabama making up numbers for Botswana, which I can find on a map, but many of the countries that I rate on 121 I can barely find on a map. I can barely place on the right continent in some cases. So I don't make the numbers up. The numbers come from places like the World Bank, IMF. The Global Competitiveness Report is a report published by the World Economic Forum out of Switzerland. It's a private group. IMD is another private group. A lot of the data are objective. They're things like tax rates. They're numbers. They're hard numbers. Tax rates, inflation rates, tariff rates, things like that. Things you can open up a government book and find the actual number. The top marginal tax rate in Botswana is 37.2% or something like that. You can find the number. But a lot of this data that we use are actually survey data. They're subjective. Things like property rights, for example. There's no book you can open up to see how secure property is, private property is in a particular country. But there are survey questions that are asked in different ways. Like they ask business people, how secure do you think the property is in the country? And they subjectively rate it on some kind of a scale. So some of the data are objective, some of them are survey. Some of them are in between. Actually, they're sort of half objective and half survey, and I could give you some examples of that. For example, there's a great set of data from the World Bank on how many days it takes to settle a contract dispute in a particular country, which is a good indicator of how efficient the private property system adjudicates disputes. And it's how many days does it take to settle a dispute? So you and I you owe me money, I have a contract with you, you owe me money, but you flaked out and didn't pay me money. If we go to court, how many days is it going to take before some judge or jury tells you to give me the money? Well, in some places it may take 7 years, in some places it may take 30 days. Okay, so what that is, it's objective in one sense, because I can open up a book, it's a World Bank publication, I can open a book and look for every country, how many days it takes to adjudicate this dispute. But it's actually kind of a survey if you really want to know, because really what they do is they go to the lawyers in that country and they say, well, what do you guys think? How many days do you think it takes? And they average out a number. So it looks objective, but really it's subjective. So anyway, we've got a mix of data, but the key thing is the third-party thing. I don't make any numbers up. It's not a beauty contest. So if you have a favorite country that you want to know how good is the country, and you look up the number in the book and you think it's completely wrong, the answer is that those guys think it's wrong. I just added the numbers up in a particular way. Okay. I do get a lot of phone calls and emails every year about the ratings. Usually I just say, if you don't like the rating, talk to those guys, because that's where the data came from. We don't make any data. The last thing is, you didn't bring the book, did you? I forgot. I gave you all my copies. If you open up the book here, it's all. I'm going to break this open.
Go ahead.
It's all. It's the most boring book you ever read. It mostly looks like this. Can you see this? Okay. This is not good reading. It's pages and pages of numbers. Okay, and that's because we wanted to do. Jim and I are scholars at heart, and we wanted to do an economic freedom index, but we wanted to make sure that the numbers that we used were seen as credible in the eyes of other scholars. And the best way we had to do that was to publish every data, every piece of number we have. So if you open up the book, mostly it's tables of numbers, and then there's a big appendix telling you where the numbers came from. Our goal is that any one of you could do this. You could follow the recipe. You could follow what we've here's the data sources. You could go collect the data, and you could get the exact same numbers that we got. Hopefully we don't do a perfect job. It's hard to be completely transparent. We really do strive to make everything that goes into the rating for each country open for inspection. It's not a black box. Okay. In the business of indexing and creating ratings for countries, there's a lot of people who create ratings for countries for different things. If you go on the internet, and you'll find people are rating countries for everything. Most of them are black boxes. Most of them simply say, I think that Belgium is a 4, and read the report, and there's no idea, and there's no way to figure out how they decided it was a 4 instead of a 3 or a 6. In ours, you may disagree with some of the choices we made, but at least you know how we arrived at the numbers that we arrived at, if you care to dig into it. Okay. So that's just a little bit about the methodology. I could go on a long time about the methodology. It's pretty boring. My life is dull, except when I get to give talks like this. You can imagine what it's like putting all those numbers into the computer. There are 43 variables, I think, now. But for simplicity purposes, they're grouped into 5 sort of content areas. And for most conversation purposes, it's best to think about these 5 areas rather than each of the 43, which you would all glaze over. Basically, to get a good number out of our index, you need to have a relatively small government in terms of taxes and spending. Doesn't mean zero. There's no government in the world that has 0 taxes. But you need to have relatively small government. The Smithian view of the world is a view that says when people are free to choose how to spend their own money, that world works better. Economic freedom involves the freedom to spend most of the money that you earn yourself. So taxes being low is good. Legal structure and property right. Yes, sir.
Government expenditures and enterprises, how does that tie into economic freedom?
Well, again,
I mean, those both tie into taxes, I understand. But,
well, we're measuring, because the flip side of expenditure, taxes turn into spending. So we're measuring, it's the same thing. In the aggregate level, government spending basically is a measure of government taxes. It's the flip sides of the same coin. Right? So and it's actually easier to get expenditure data than it is to get revenue data for most countries in the world. So some of it is driven by our data availability issues. Yes?
It seems like the government and people really decide what their economic practice is in terms of raising taxes, lowering taxes, whatever they want to. But it would seem that there's more of an objective principle here, where if you have a certain good, it's like goods and services. If not everyone can be a doctor, not everyone can be a lawyer, but you may at one point need a doctor and a lawyer. So people will specialize in certain areas, doctors, lawyers, and farmers, and that. But again, the item that they produce, whether it be has a certain value to it, and therefore a doctor service are much more expensive than maybe a farmer service. So, I mean, how would you explain that in terms of how a government decides high taxes, low taxes, and, you know.
Okay, what I'm really interested in is the issue of freedom. Okay, I'm interested in, are people free to spend their resources as they see fit, or are other people, usually the government, deciding for them how those resources are to be spent? I'm actually not speaking about anything else as far as where the resources came from, why some people have more resources than other people have resources. There are economic theories as to why that might be the case. Supply and demand would be a good place to start. But I'm really just interested in this issue of, are people free to spend their resources for themselves, or are third-party governments deciding for them at some collective level? That's the issue that we're trying to measure in the first area. Okay. The second area is private property rights. I've got 3 different sources, 7 different variables, trying to get at how secure private property is. Okay. Sound money. One of the kinds of taxes that doesn't show up in the government's budget is inflation. When the government prints up a lot of money and creates, at some point, inflation, that's just like a tax. Monetary economists talk about the inflation tax, and inflation acts just like a tax on any monetary holding you have. And in many places in the world, you have governments like Zimbabwe's, for example, which don't actually have a lot of direct taxes. They don't actually take people's money through income, sales, and other sorts of direct taxes like we think of when we think of taxes. But they print money, which is a type of indirect tax. So we have Area 3 really to capture that particular type of infringement on people's ability to keep and earn their income. Third one is free trade. This is sort of the nearest and dearest to Smith's heart, since Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, in large part to advocate for free international trade as a policy matter. And we have a lot of measures in here: tariffs, non-tariff barriers, quotas. We have some measures of capital controls, the type of not just goods protectionism, capital protectionism as well. And then the last one is a very large area on regulation of different types of credit markets, like interest rate controls, labor markets like minimum wage regulations. One of my favorites is conscription. One of the biggest infringements on anyone's freedom is if the government says you have to work for the army. You can't work for who you want to work for. You have to work for the army because we say so. And then business regulations of a general sort, like price controls, starting a business regulations. That same data set I mentioned with the contracts is a great data set that the World Bank has, where you open up the book and it says how many days does it take to start a business in a particular country. And they've gone all throughout the world and tried to estimate how many days it takes to start a business. How many impediments are there? They'll even have how many steps are involved. How many offices do you have to visit to open up, like a dry cleaner in Cairo? And how many offices do you have to visit to open a dry cleaner in Rome and so forth? A wonderful set of data there. Okay, so we've got 40-some variables, but they collapse into these 5 sort of areas. To do well on the index, you need a relatively small government, reasonably secure property, reasonably secure monetary policy that doesn't create a lot of inflation, reasonably free trade, and reasonably unregulated markets in these dimensions. Okay, that's what we do. It probably appears to be a black box to you at this point, but again, the details are in there. So, yes, sir?
Can you say something about the weighting? Obviously,
yeah, I can say something about the weighting. We've experimented over the years with numerous weighting systems, and one of the weighting systems we've used is something complicated like principal component analysis, which is a statistical process. Actually, at present, we've returned to the simple weighting of equal weighting. It's all done by averages at this point. So each of these areas is 20% of the index. Partly that's driven because it turns out that the more sophisticated statistical type weightings don't give you answers that are that different than simple weighting. There are some technical reasons associated with it's a lot harder. It's easier to do this. The other thing is I've got several audiences in mind, and one of the audiences for this project is journalists and policymakers, and the more sophisticated techniques really tended to be an impediment with them. They didn't understand how the weighting was done, and that turned out to be an impediment. Everybody knows what an average is. The real answer to your question is I don't know what the right weighting system is for